Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of November 6th, 2025. My very special guest today is author Leo Damrosch, who has written a brand new biography of one of my favorite writers, Robert Louis Stevenson, published by Yale University Press. Leo Damrosch spent his boyhood in the mountains of the Philippines. He was born in 1941 in Manila, where his parents were Episcopalian missionaries. 3 months later, World War II arrived, and the family was interned with 1,500 other foreigners in the Los Baños prison camp in Luzon. In 1945, they were liberated by a dramatic airborne operation. After the families returned to the United States in 1950, they lived in various towns in Maine. Leo received his B.A. from Yale University. He was a Marshall Scholar at Trinity College, Cambridge, and received his Ph.D. from Princeton University. He taught in the English department at the University of Virginia from 1966 to 1983, at the University of Maryland at College Park from 1983 to 1989, and since 1989 at Harvard University, where he is now Ernest Birnbaum Research Professor of Literature Emeritus. He is the author of several books, including Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Restless Genius, published by Houghton Mifflin in 2005, a National Book Award finalist for nonfiction and winner of the Winship Penn New England Award for nonfiction. Tocqueville's Discovery of America, published by Farrar Straus Giroux in 2010. Jonathan Swift, His Life and His World, published by Yale University Press in 2013, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Biography. Eternity's Sunrise, The Imaginative World of William Blake, published by Yale in 2015, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. The Club, Johnson, Boswell, and the Friends Who Shaped an Age, published by Yale in 2019, named one of the 10 best books of 2019 by the New York Times. And Adventurer, The Life and Times of Giacomo Casanova, published by Yale in 2022. His most recent book, and the one he is here to talk with me about today, is entitled Storyteller, The Life of Robert Louis Stevenson, published on September 2nd of this year by Yale University Press. It was reviewed by the Christian Science Monitor on August 21st, by the Wall Street Journal on August 29th, by the Washington Post on September 5th, by the New York Times on September 7th, and by the Times Literary Supplement on October 17th, 2025. My conversation with Leo Damrosch begins now. Leo Damrosch, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You're a biographer of Robert Louis Stevenson, and as you so acutely note in your book, we cannot assume that anyone knows his literature anymore, the books that he wrote. So let's not assume that they also know who Robert Louis Stevenson is. Let's begin, if you will, by chronologically placing him in time. Tell us where he was born and when he was born and died.
Well, he was born in 1850, the dead center of the 19th century, which makes him a Victorian historically, but in fact, he was quite disaffected from Victorian literature as we now know it. And it was really the modernist period that brought him back as a great writer. He'd been kind of dismissed as a children's writer. He wrote boys' books. Treasure Island is the one that everybody used to read. There's also one called Kidnapped. We might end up talking about both of those. And they are actually wonderful books. And as various recent writers like Italo Calvino have said, those are very adult books seen through the eyes of a boy narrator who is growing up, finding out who he is, finding out who he can't trust. So they're actually very serious books. But Stevenson was also an experimentalist. He wrote all kinds of things. He wrote a kind of gothic horror story, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which gave birth to a number of not very good movies. And we might talk at some point about why it literally can't be filmed the way it was conceived as a brilliant short novel. He wrote some other fiction. Some of it is good. Some of it was pot boilers. He needed money and found he could make a lot of money by producing what the public would buy. He was a poet, a quite good poet, not one of the greatest ones, but a considerable poet. And children used to all have A Child's Garden of Verses read to them. And Stevenson's close friend, Henry James, said, uh, those are poems a child could have written if a child could see childhood from outside. So again, it's imagining what it would be like to be very small and just kind of baffled by the huge adults that you were living among. And he wrote travel books as well and a lot of essays, and died at the age of 44 in 1894. And by then, having made enough money to do so, he and his wife had been cruising the entire Pacific Ocean, stopping at islands everywhere. And they fell in love with the Samoan Islands, which are very large, unlike most of the atolls they stopped at. And they bought several hundred acres of mountainside, intending to support themselves with a plantation, and they got the thing going. And he loved Samoa. The Samoan people loved him. At that time, the islands of the Pacific were being parceled out among the great powers, as they called themselves. Indeed, just a few years after that was when the United States acquired the Philippines and Puerto Rico and indeed Hawaii. Uh, and Stevenson was a champion of the rights of the people who had lived there for so many generations, and they regarded him as their hero. Uh, and then he died too soon, just not just because at such an early age, but he didn't live into the modernist period where I think he would have written like D.H. Lawrence or somebody like that and could never have been dismissed as an obsolete Victorian. So that's the general arc of his life.
Hmm. It's a remarkable life, and you have written an astonishing biography of this man, 450 pages. I wondered if at any point when you were working on this, if you were secretly glad that he died at the age of 44, because you might have extended this quite a ways had he lived longer.
Well, that's true, but it would have he would have deserved it.
Yeah, of
Uh,
course.
the main thing I did that previous biographers did not, and there were about 12 of them before my
Hmm.
time. And by the way, I should say there used to be a concept of a definitive biography. This can never be superseded. Nobody who's any good believes that anymore. Every biographer has different insights, different perspective.
Hmm.
And I quote quite a few of the previous ones in my book because I feel like we're all people who love Stevenson and we're having a kind of conversation. But what I did do that the others had not done was make full use of Stevenson's letters, which were scattered all over the world and for generations only existed in a very pared down and Bowdlerized version that a friend of his uh, took everything out that might have offended sensibilities in the 19th century. And finally, Yale University Press, which is also my publisher, brought out an 8-volume edition of Stevenson's correspondence in 1995. And only a couple of biographers have written since then and used it at all. And those letters are amazing. They are just full of wit and uh, uh, obscenity when he feels like it, and playfulness. And he cultivated his friendships intensely, and there were people who loved him, and he wrote to each of them in a sort of in their own particular way of thinking about things. It's so rich. So I drew on that. And also, a lot of people who knew him left reminiscences of him, and many of them were good writers. And I don't know why biographers haven't searched for those things. So there are all these accounts about what he was like by people who knew him well. So I feel like I could bring him to life in a way that had never been done before. And that was the main reason I wrote that book.
Hmm. You often quote from his stepson and step grandson many years later, who have this, who sat right there with him, of course, and did things and saw things that other people didn't. I want to ask you a question as a biographer, because as our listeners have heard, you've written biographers of some pretty major figures who were very prolific. Rousseau, Jonathan Swift, Stevenson, and of course you've written about Casanova and also about Samuel Johnson and his world. How do you prepare as you write these biographies? What's the first thing you do to get yourself ready to write about these people are usually prodigious output?
Well, there's usually some impulse that makes me think of writing that person's biography. And In the case of Rousseau, I was teaching a seminar at Harvard back in the 90s on the thought of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which is mostly political thought, but also a very wide range of interests. And partly because I can read French. I don't speak it as well as I wish I did, but I can read it easily. And it was fun to work on somebody where all the documents are in French and all the scholarship really is in French. And the more I got into it, the more I thought the existing biographies are terrible. They make him sound like a boring person. He was eccentric and strange uh, and a genius. One thing that attracted me to him is he never went to school for one single day. He was entirely homeschooled, as we would say now. And that's also true of somebody else I've always loved and have written a biography of, and that's William Blake. Never went to school. And so they saw society and human behavior from a different perspective than somebody who always passed exams and got A's right through, which was true even of people like Voltaire and Diderot, who were um, acquaintances of Rousseau and philosophers at the same time. But his thought was much deeper than theirs and crucial to the founders of the United States of America. So I just found myself wanting to do it. And other things come up just by chance. My wife was reading one of Stevenson's less known novels called Catriona. It's set in Scotland 100 years before his time. He was a Scot and fascinated by the culture that the English tried to stamp out once Scotland became part of Great Britain. She was reading Catriona, and she said, "Why don't you consider writing a biography of Stevenson?" And I thought, gee, why don't I? It kind of came out of the blue. And then, I start looking around and seeing what's already there. And if there is a wonderful biography, I'm certainly not going to try to compete with it, but I thought it could be done. So there's no one thing that I do. Uh, I'll say one thing about my method. I think a lot of people do the research for chapter one and then they write chapter one and then they go on to chapter two. I'll never do that. I read everything that I might have some use for before I write one word.
Hmm.
So I can realize, my goodness, even though that happened late in his life, I could talk about it here earlier because it fits in some way. So in a sense, I'm always kind of working on the biography, even when I'm just doing the research.
Sure. And I think I know the answer to this. Anybody who's read your books knows, but you clearly also read everything, I think, that these writers have written, which in the case of all the ones that we've mentioned here is it's pretty remarkable. It's prodigious.
Yeah, that's right. I enjoy reading, and these people are worth reading.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think the kind of slash and burn biographer who kind of gets into the subject, but not deeply enough, is always disappointing. And also, it helps me that I'm an academic, although I try not to be writing for academics anymore. But people don't know how to do research. So they don't realize there's a lot of material if I would go digging for it that might be really interesting. So they're working with sort of obvious stuff that's easy to get their hands on. And again, with Stevenson, I was digging up all kinds of things. They were right there in libraries that nobody thought to look at.
One of the things you do that I really enjoy when biographers do is when you talked about a particular place where Stevenson was geographically, a house he lived in, or something like that. You always tell the reader, you sort of stand at our elbow and say, by the way, the house isn't there anymore. Here's what is. And it's amazing to me how many people don't, because I sort of think we all think, is that still there? Can I go see it? Which leads me to ask, did you walk the ground Stevenson walked for all the and this guy was a traveler. For all the places he went, did you go?
No, I wish I had, but I was working on this book during the pandemic.
Hmm.
Nobody was traveling,
Yeah.
and I didn't want to wait, to work on what I was eager to get on with. I have done that in the past.
Hmm.
For Rousseau, I certainly went to places in Europe. He was actually born in Geneva in Switzerland, though he was
Hmm.
French. Went to places that have associations with him, or even buildings that he once lived in. For Jonathan Swift, whose biography I wrote some years ago, uh, we traveled all over Ireland, and it was worth it because the places he was associated with are pretty obscure, and it was important to see them and take pictures that I could put in the book myself. And to discover that although I could visit the places, no house or building he lived in still exists in Ireland.
Mm.
Uh,
Hmm.
the one that might have was the deanery. He was dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, and that was a distinguished post. But it burned down in the 19th century and was replaced. Uh,
Hmm.
so I could see the cathedral itself, but the rest of it, it was more landscape and the ambience of a remote lake in north of Dublin where one of his friends had a place, and he would go and stay there for months. And it was important to see that place.
Hmm. One of the other things that you do as a biographer that I've noticed throughout is you resist hagiography. You don't come to these so that you can basically tell people how this unflawed life these people live, nor do you write with the goal of tearing anybody down. Even Stevenson, who from our perspective looks like a colonialist. If you don't know anything about what he wrote, what is he doing in Samoa? He's buried there. He bought these hundreds of acres, as you mentioned. There were natives of Samoa who worked on his plantation, and that's what they called it. But you resist. You're very even-handed as you go through and you talk about these people. You're quite critical of his writing and of him at times.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, there's no point writing a saint's life, but also, as you say, there's no point debunking somebody completely. The biggest challenge for me wasn't Stevenson because he actually was quite a lovable person. But Casanova, the ultimate bad boy. Uh, and but he was a great writer, and he was not just a seducer, although he certainly enjoyed doing that. He was a magus. He persuaded people he had magical powers to extract money from them. But he had a lot of gifts. He created the first national lottery for the government of France, and it made him rich, although he squandered it all. And it was an absolutely legitimate operation. He understood uh, that it would not be the state gambling; it would be the state making sure the house always wins. And so actually produced a lot of income, the French lottery. And but also, and I think this, I'm not whitewashing him, he really loved women and he wasn't just using them. And in his memoir, he describes many, many dozens of women that he had relationships with that were real relationships that didn't usually last very long. And he describes each person differently. She was interesting in her own way. And I think they felt that in him. So he was not a rapist. I mean, he was not a monster. But yeah, he always moved on, and they usually couldn't. They were married or young women who were still in their family or whatever. And I didn't want to say that everything he did was good, but I wanted to say he's worth knowing about. And his self-knowledge as he writes this memoir, uh, ill and unhappy and in kind of exile late in his life, it's really trying to relive when he was young and attractive and vigorous and imaginative, and it has a lot of energy in it. Uh, so yeah, trying to be even-handed and I hope succeeding.
And I thought you were going to say that the greatest challenge you had in talking about Robert Louis Stevenson was not him, but about his wife, who we'll get to in a minute. But I want to start with Robert Louis Stevenson's name because I am currently listening to the audiobook narrated by Timothy West, who is a fantastic British now deceased actor with a magnificent voice, and he narrates Treasure Island. But he introduces the book as having been written by Robert Louis Stevenson, and I've heard that from dozens of other people. You make it a point to tell us how you pronounce and what name did he go by?
He went by the name Lewis, which is how
Mm-hmm.
it's pronounced, and I'll explain that. Um, uh, he was his grandfathers were Robert Stevenson and the Reverend Louis Balfour, so he was Robert Louis Balfour Stevenson, and um, it was always spelled Lewis, and always pronounced that way by everybody that knew him. But because he fell in love with France as a young man and became perfectly fluent in French, he started spelling it Louis because he just thought that looked cool. But nobody called him that. And to this day, everyone in England, as you say, calls him Louis. And they laugh at Americans for calling him Louis. But everybody he knew called him Louis. So it was
Mm-hmm.
just a kind of affectation to spell it that way.
Yeah, and he's in his 44 years, he did live a remarkably active life for someone who was sickly. And so let's get this right off the bat. People think he had tuberculosis and that's why he traveled and that's what he died from. But on your very first page, you say he may or he may not have had tuberculosis. Do we know what he had?
Yeah, it's always very difficult. There are gifted physician writers who've tried to figure out what various people in the past actually had wrong with them, and they said it's just working from documents. A lot of it has to be guesswork. But we do know this much about the TB. He certainly thought he had it, and he spent some time in a sanatorium in Switzerland, where the mountain air was supposed to be good for somebody with TB. And Eventually, he found out that he probably didn't have TB because when he had married an American and had moved to upstate New York before he migrated onto the Pacific, uh, he lived in a small town called Saranac Lake, which is quite close to the Canadian border. Bitter cold winter. And because, again, the dry air was supposed to be good for you, a physician had founded a small institution there that was for people with tuberculosis and other conditions. And that guy uh, actually was a gifted researcher and isolated the bacillus of tuberculosis under a microscope, which had never been done, and tested Stevenson and said, that's not what you have. He had some kind of hereditary lung condition. His mother had it too. Various diagnoses have been suggested. It was certainly dangerous. He would cough up pints of blood. He would be ordered to stay completely motionless in bed. Some of his best writing was living in his imagination when he couldn't have an active life as he longed to have. Uh, so it's quite amazing that in spite of this really serious ill health, he just took so much pleasure in life. And he was not a kind of, professional sick person. He minimized it as much as he could. And those last years were the happiest years because he actually got well in Samoa. The climate and the lack of stress probably also agreed with him. Uh, and what killed him wasn't that at all. He died of a stroke all of a sudden. He was helping his wife make salad dressing, and he suddenly said, "Do I look strange?" and fell over and never spoke again. And the cause, almost certainly, which nobody then would know, is he was a total chain smoker from early adulthood on. He once said, "I always have a cigarette in my hand except if I'm coughing or kissing." And so he was carried off by the last thing he expected.
And one reviewer, and this has been reviewed widely, by the way, and wonderful reviews, said he enjoyed tobacco and whiskey. The tobacco I remembered. I cannot confess I don't remember you talking about how much whiskey he drank.
He didn't drink a lot. Uh, there were friends of his who were clearly already alcoholics as young men.
Hmm.
And probably also because of his health condition, he felt it didn't agree with him, but he just didn't like it that well. Uh, he would drink it socially, but he preferred wine. Uh,
Yeah.
he once said he was what that sanatorium in Switzerland, and there was a very boring river flowing through the town, and he said, I only like water if it's rushing past or well qualified with whiskey." So it's not like he had any prejudice against it.
Hmm.
I think he was just cautious for his health, and he loved wine, and why shouldn't he stick to wine?
Yeah, and that place in Switzerland, by the way, was at a place that's very famous now.
Yeah, Davos, which
Hmm.
back then was just a bunch of little houses and nobody there but sick people. So there was no World Economic Forum and no ski
And,
resort.
and he didn't like it.
No,
Too
he
cold.
didn't like it a
He did
bit.
not. Yeah, not at all. Um, One of the other things you do that I think sets your biography apart, based upon what I have read about other biographies, is the treatment of his wife, Fanny Vandegrift Osborne, a remarkable woman in her own right, but you treat her sympathetically and as someone who helped him become what we all love and enjoy and remember, this great artist. Talk a little bit about her. She is a remarkable person in her own right.
Yeah, and he always said marrying her was the best thing he ever did in his life, and I think it's true. Um, he had um, sort of uh, not exciting relationships with some of the young Edinburgh women he grew up with. They were very proper and we would say repressed, and taught not to even make eye contact. And in the end, he was never going to spend his life with one of them. In fact, as a young man, he spent quite a bit of time with prostitutes in Edinburgh, and actually, admired their courage. They had been dealt a very bad hand of cards in life, and they were doing the best they could. And he thought they were good human beings who, he cared for them as people. He had so little prejudice, that kind or racial. It's quite remarkable given the time and place that where he came from. Um, and he was staying at an artist colony outside Paris, where some of his friends were, and most of the people there were men. And he'd gone on a kayaking trip with one of his buddies just on little backwaters in France. And when they came back, he looked in the window of the inn where all the artists were having dinner, and he saw this woman, herself an artist, Fanny, as you say, Frances originally, but nobody ever called her by that name. Um, and he claimed it was love at first sight. And he has several stories where that happens. A woman turns around, a man sees her face. It's just the face he always wanted. So he probably felt it more keenly than she. She was still married, trying to get detached from a perfectly decent person, but a horribly philandering husband that cheated on her continuously. And she had kids, and she was 10 years older than he was. But it's clear that that's not why he was attracted. It was sexual. She was passionate. Uh, she was unique. She had lived for years in mining towns in the West, where her husband had dreams of getting rich, right in the frontier. She was a crack shot with a pistol. She took her pistol to a Brussels gunsmith to have it cleaned, and he said it was worth a lifetime to have seen this thing. Uh, and she was very intelligent. And uh, after they were married, she not only was his nurse because she would see him through these health crises, but she was his best critic. She read all of his work in manuscript and often had crucial suggestions to make, saw that what he wasn't thinking about that would be the real point of a story or a novel. So he valued her totally. There's a story by Dickens called The Cricket on the Hearth. And so Stevenson used to call Fanny the critic on the hearth. She's always right there. Uh, and people who knew them said it was a grand passion. They were both in love with each other, and it never faded.
And she, as you note, a lot of people left written descriptions of Robert Louis Stevenson and talked about just sort of what a jovial person he was. He always was just sort of lit up the room. They had often less kind things to say about her. Servants are sometimes dismissed, and it's not clear why. And you speculate sometimes that perhaps they clashed with Fanny, and she's kind of gotten. I don't want to overstate this, but she's sort of gotten a raw deal from a lot of biographers, I
Oh,
think.
absolutely. And it is partly because she was being quite rightly protective of him. He was a social animal, and he would stay up all night when he was in terrible health, and his
Hmm.
friends would not respect that,
Hmm.
wouldn't believe it. Uh, and if they would, they often loved Fanny. And a wonderful example is his parents, who were rich, had bought them a house in Bournemouth, which is a town on the south coast of England, where a lot of people went who had health issues. And Henry James's sister Alice was in some kind of institution there for her health. And Henry would come down to visit her and got to know the Stevensons, and became a dear friend of both of them, both Stevensons. And it's because he was kind and understanding and not a kind of a bully. But Fanny would protect her husband, I think rightly, from people who just wanted to talk all night and drink all night and, not respect his needs. But as for the biographers, I just don't understand it. I think they don't want to think that Fanny was as important as she really was. And I can't resist saying the worst of them, in my view, that is the most ungenerous, are women biographers. And I always think of the old Aretha Franklin song, "It Should Have Been Me."
Well, and one of the things that you make clear is that Stevenson sort of has a reputation as being this bohemian who, has all these pictures. He's not unlike Oscar Wilde. He's wearing velvet jackets, and he's just sort of out there, if you will. But you make it clear this was a guy who worked very hard. He did, of course, have that side of him. In every picture, he's got this sort of half smile and a twinkle in his eye, no matter what he's doing. Very slight of frame, not a big person at all, sort of tall and thin, who wore these clothes that made him look almost like a buccaneer. But he worked very hard at being a writer, which is really the only profession I think he ever had. He never really had a profession. I know he got a law degree, but he never really worked as a lawyer. And this was part of the conflict between he and his parents, was it not?
Well, in the end, I think they were very generous about it and understanding. Uh, his father and his grandfather were civil engineers who designed lighthouses. They designed and built, supervised the building of dozens of lighthouses on the rocky Scottish coast where there are constant shipwrecks before. Uh, and they were known as the Lighthouse Stevensons. And he was the only child in his family, and it was just assumed that he would follow in their footsteps. And he was willing to do it. He made trips as a teenager to visit the construction sites and all that, but he was just hopeless at math. I mean, almost absurdly bad at math, and I'm not good at it myself. And it became clear he's just not going to be able to do this kind of a profession. And he always felt a little guilty about it. Like, my people built these monuments, and all I do is write on pieces of paper. It's kind of touching. So they said, well, you ought to do something to support yourself. So why don't you get a law degree? He attended the University of Edinburgh. He cut class all the time. Uh, he was in a theater group, and there were various things that were more interesting to him. But he loyally studied the law, and people have looked into what he did, that there was a lot of very technical lore that he had to understand, and he did so, and he passed the bar and never practiced 1 minute in his life. And became clear they just had to accept that he always wanted to be a writer. From his very earliest days, he would tell stories to himself, before he could even write them down. And he was a voracious reader of all kinds of fiction, very wide taste, read French as easily as English. And that was his vocation in the old sense of a calling. I mean, it was what he had to do. And his father, although a civil engineer and in many ways a proper Edinburgh, upstanding member of society, had a kind of a fantasy life of his own, which was he would put himself to sleep every night dreaming of highwaymen and robberies and pirates and stuff like that. And when Stevenson got the idea for Treasure Island, his parents happened to be staying with him, and his father just lit up and started contributing suggestions for Treasure Island. So in a way, it made sense to his parents, and I don't think they regretted his making that turn when it became clear that's just what he had to do.
And you note that they financially supported him really through much of, half of his life, it seemed like, because he didn't live to be old, but it took him a while to be able to support himself financially with his own writing.
Yeah, they were very generous about that. And some of his friends who really had to work hard to put food on
hmm
the table were a little
hmm
bit resentful, like he's the privileged rich kid.
Trust fund. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
hmm
And I think he didn't mean to abuse his privilege. He knew it was privilege, but still, yeah, he had it.
So let's talk about his writing, because one of the great joys of your biographies, and in particular, is that you introduce the reader to all of, as you say, he wrote 11 novels, the last one of which was unpublished, several of which actually are unpublished.
Well, the last one was unfinished.
Unfinished. I'm sorry, not unpublished, but unfinished. That's right. And there were several that were unfinished. Over 100 essays, several hundred poems. There are plays that he wrote, not very successful, but they're there. One of the great joys, if you have an electronic reader these days, is you can download at practically no cost at all everything writers like Swift and Stevenson wrote. And I was overjoyed to find, as I read your book, I actually opened up my Kindle, looked at the complete works of Stevenson, and I'm putting air quotes around that, to find that even the books you mentioned that were not finished, those fragments are there. I mean, a modern reader can read literally everything Stevenson wrote. And I want to ask you about some of the short stories that people, the modern readers, probably don't know, never heard of, but that were quite well done and are hailed as some of the best that have ever been written. Thrawn Janet, This time of year, particularly, you often see it reprinted in spooky anthologies. The Body Snatcher, The Pavilion on the Links, which Arthur Conan Doyle said if he had written nothing else, that would have justified his stature. The Bottle Imp, which I'm actually working through right now, which is a really
Uh-huh.
fun story. Talk a little bit about these short stories, what they meant to him, why he wrote these, why he sort of specialized. Because we think of him as being a novelist, but he wrote some really great short stories, if not
Yeah,
known, not well known.
yeah, and he always wanted to simplify and condense and let you feel rather than read a long description of something. He once said, "If only I had the art to omit, just leave things out." Uh, and short stories were a great genre for him. And by short story, I think he understood, as like Edgar Allan Poe did, whom he admired, uh, that it's not just a story that happens to not be very long. It should be condensed and complete in itself in some way, almost like a poem. And the ones you mentioned, often he enjoyed imagining his way into some time in the past or a different culture and get inside it and what it would feel like. Thrawn Janet is about a rustic village in Scotland, and there's a woman who's I think she had a stroke and her neck is all awry, and then the Thrawn apparently means that she's got a crooked neck. But she's just a person. But increasingly, it becomes clear she's been possessed literally by the devil. And the real Janet is already dead, and this walking corpse is the Prince of Darkness himself. And it's all told by a local person in the voice and dialect of the south of Scotland that he would use. And it just fascinated Stevenson to imagine a time when the supernatural could have seemed very real in the culture he grew up in, but was now obviously very modern and civilized. Uh, and the Bottle Imp you mentioned is a story about set in the South Seas, because he was living there by then, in which there is some mysterious being inside a bottle that will grant you enormous wealth and so on, but you must pass it along to somebody else because otherwise you will have to die. And so everybody who's owned the Bottle Imp has managed to pawn it off on someone else. And what happens when you're the guy holding it at the end? It's just a kind of charming, fascinating story. Uh, but um, but he's imagining a culture where that would be real. And in fact, his friends, his Samoan friends, couldn't understand how he had all this money because by then his novels had been huge success, and he was able to not just buy a plantation, but import redwood from California to have a great hall lined with it. And they figured that a safe that he had must have the Bottle Imp in it.
And you
And
had to sell the Bottle Imp to somebody for less than you bought it, right?
exactly.
Yeah,
And they would
right.
say, before I go, would you mind letting me see the Bottle Imp?
Yeah, yeah. And the Pavilion on the Links, some of these he just sort of almost tossed off, right? He was writing.
Yeah,
He hated writing on deadline and for money.
that's right.
Mhm.
Just detested it. And sometimes he got lucky, as he did with Treasure Island. Um, Somebody had come up to the place where he was staying in Scotland, an English publisher, to talk to him about Thoreau, because Stevenson was an admirer of Thoreau. And found that just for fun, he and his stepson were writing this novel about pirate treasure. Uh, and they began just as a sort of game among themselves. And the guy got interested and said, you know what, I could get you a contract for that thing. How about it? And Stevenson wrote up the first half of it rapidly and then hit the wall. Didn't know what to do next. Waited till he was in Switzerland, which was the next place he went to live. Suddenly got it going again, finished it in a white heat. So he got lucky with that one. But usually when he committed himself to write for a deadline, he detested it and wished he hadn't done it.
Hmm. You even mentioned that if you read Treasure Island, you know it's narrated by Jim Hawkins. But at one point, the narration, and when Jim goes to the island, we need to know what's happening on the ship. I think I've got this correct. But anyway, he has Dr. Livesay narrate a couple of chapters. And you talked about how it took him a while to be able to do that. He didn't know how to shift narrators in the middle of a book.
Yeah, and it's not that easy to do, but he makes it work. And once he figured that out, he did it in a number of novels afterwards, and it gives
Hmm.
a great kind of richness because the person who begins telling you the story probably doesn't understand everything about it, and then
Hmm.
somebody else gets to talk, and that's certainly true of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where there's a series of narrators, and not until the very end do you kind of get the punchline and realize what was going on the whole time.
Hmm. We'll come back to that one because in that one in particular, I think his wife played a critical role in the final product. But let's talk about his writing style. You say, and I want to quote here: Stevenson's novels and stories combine two different kinds of excellence that aren't often found together. He is at once an exacting craftsman and a spellbinding narrator. You also say that he was a master of art that conceals art, which they said of Spencer Tracy as an actor who, ironically, did one of the really bad versions of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But what is art that conceals art? And talk about what you mean about Stevenson's combining these two different kinds of excellence. What made his writing so unique?
Well, I don't know if it is unique, but it's modern. As I was trying to say, we think of Victorian narration as heavy, full of opinions, um, kind of constantly, sort of teasing or talking to the reader. Uh, and it can be good. I think George Eliot is the greatest novelist in the English language, and she definitely sort of sits back and chats with the reader about what her characters are doing and how we might think about them. But what Stevenson wants to do is absolutely uh, get you inside this forward energy of a story. So you're not even thinking it's being narrated to me by a novelist. You're there. And he always said he wanted it to be kinetic, not static. It should be in motion. And I think that's his great gift. Storytelling, which is not just relating a tale, but getting you inside it. What if I were trying to steel myself to leap across that rushing stream in the Highlands of Scotland because otherwise the British troops are going to catch me? And uh, the father of Andrew Wyeth was N.C. Wyeth, a very gifted illustrator, and he illustrated Stevenson novels brilliantly. So he illustrates that moment where the young man is just desperately trying to make himself jump across this perilous stream to safety. And Andrew Wyeth said his dad always would read through Stevenson's novels looking for those critical moments. Uh, and uh, and he also once said, death to the optic nerve. He didn't want like, pictorial description. And somebody who admired his Scottish novels said, "You've really described the Highlands brilliantly." And he said, "You go back and read them, you won't find a single descriptive word. I'm making you understand what it feels like to be clambering through those rocky hills." So I think that's his particular gift, and it's very modern. And it's not like he admired Victorian novelists, and I do, but he just didn't want to write like them. He it's the great modernists like Proust or Calvino or Borges or Nabokov. All of them have celebrated Stevenson as a great narrator.
Hmm. And I want to talk about the fact that he was friends with one of the great Victorian novelists whose work was very different from his, to say the least. But you talk about, and you alluded to it there without using, he didn't like adjectives. He told people, stop using adjectives, use verbs. Give us an example of how that played out in real life as he's writing.
Well, I don't know, like give an example off the top of my head, but there was a young woman in Bournemouth, the place where he's staying in the south of England, who was interested in maybe becoming a writer. And she would show him her work. And he would say, you called the grass green. We know grass is green. If you can't find something interesting to say that makes that grass different from other grass, don't do it. Uh, so I think it was that. It was the paring away the art to omit, to give you the sense of forward rushing motion that is always what he wanted in a story.
Hmm.
He loved Dumas. He loved, the Count of Monte Cristo. He loved adventurous stories.
And do you think his inspiration for that kind of writing, was there anybody else out there? You mentioned Poe. Poe, of course, wrote great short stories. This wasn't an invention, I'm assuming, of his own. Was he inspired by other people, or did he really pioneer in this?
I think he did kind of pioneer in it because it was the kind of stories he always loved to read, and they were not the ones that his contemporaries were writing.
Hmm.
And it's not surprising that the Bloomsbury group, the E.M. Forster, Virginia Woolf group, just despised Stevenson. They thought he was a boring old Victorian because, who cares about pirates and adventures? We're interested in the fine-tuned details of social life. Uh,
Hmm.
and it was, I'll quote Calvino again. He said, um, the reason he would tell you a story from the perspective of a boy or a very young man is that's the only way he could do it and not be and not write a parody because adventure was held in contempt by then. C.S. Lewis was a great admirer of Stevenson. He said, if we've lost our taste for adventure, it's like, we're losing our hair and our palate and finally our hopes.
Hmm.
I remember when I was a young man, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was held in contempt by literary critics and by many novelists. And lo and behold, it has outlived most of the Pulitzer Prize winners of its time because it's still a very great story. And Stevenson would have loved The Lord of the Rings.
And you've noted that his works did not appear in anthologies for most of the 20th century. And why
Yeah,
is it because his books are just seen as boys' stories?
yeah, exactly. The one that people who teach in English departments usually have used is called the Norton Anthology of British Literature, and I think it probably gone through 10 different editions, and every one of them is different, and they keep adding stuff, and they never have room for Stevenson, and they have
Hmm.
room for writers that I think are far less compelling than Stevenson. But like, yeah, he's always been under that cloud. They
Hmm.
finally put in Jekyll and Hyde, but that's very untypical of most of Stevenson's writing.
Yeah, not any of his short stories that we mentioned
No, which they
or
could
his
have easily
essays.
done. That's
Hmm.
right.
Hmm. He wrote an essay, for instance, on Thoreau, which I think is very interesting. But again, you won't find it anywhere unless you go and download all of this collected works electronically.
Yeah, forgive me, the most interesting thing about that essay is, although he admired Thoreau and was interested in him, he said, yeah, there's no real human relationships. There's certainly no kissing in Thoreau. He said it's not surprising he felt an affinity with the fish.
Right, right. Lived alone in a cabin, which is one thing, of course, that Stevenson didn't do. He
That's
he
right.
needed human contact and friendship, and you bring those friendships to life. It's remarkable. Two of the ones that really stand out are with William Ernest Henley, who is probably known to people today most famously for his poem Invictus. He was, I think, the inspiration for Long John Silver because
That's
he
right.
himself had lost part of a leg. And Henry James, this is the most remarkable. And I know at least one reviewer talked. You reduced us to tears at the end of the book because Henry James writes a remarkable letter to Fanny Stevenson after Lewis's death, and says, I paraphrase it, which does it no justice at all, but I can't begin to feel what you feel. You were closest to him. Of course, you were going to feel more than any. But several reviewers have said that letter, Henry James, if you've tried to read his novels, I think he's the quintessential Victorian. His paragraphs go on for pages. Nobody ever does anything. They're talking to each other, and you have to drive stakes in the ground to see if anything is happening. He and Stevenson were the best of friends, and he admired Stevenson's work.
Yeah, I think I can talk about both those people.
Hmm.
With Henley. Um, yeah, Henley had not just lost a leg, but he had some kind of tubercular condition of the bones. So it seemed likely that he would have to lose both legs. And he was a big, powerful, athletic guy, and it would be just, a catastrophe for a man of enormous energy to be in a wheelchair. And he went to Edinburgh because there was a physician there who uh, had a new kind of treatment that might make it possible to save the other leg. And it succeeded. But he had to be, I think, for a year and a half confined to a bed in a hospital being treated. And Stevenson, through a mutual friend, got to meet him and they bonded. And Stevenson always admired Henley's energy and love of life and refusal to be kept down. So it was a very invigorating connection. And later on, Henley became a sort of journalist publisher and helped Stevenson a lot, connecting him with the London publishing industry. Uh, but I'll say one other thing. You mentioned the poem Invictus. It used to be despised as a typical Victorian poem because I am the captain of my soul. And it was written by a guy who was lying helpless in bed. And by God, I'm Invictus, I'm undefeated. You know, they can't destroy me. And there is a movie about Nelson Mandela in which Morgan Freeman playing Mandela recites that poem to his fellow prisoners in Robben Island prison in South Africa. So that was one person that Stevenson bonded with. And then James, yeah, James is highly cultivated Boston Brahmin. Uh, he was visiting his sister Alice, as I mentioned, and she despised Stevenson and hated Fanny. Uh, and James is this lovable character, very open and kind of tender, and they loved him. And he wrote that letter, as you say, it's just a beautiful letter because he's saying the only consolation I hope you do have is that young though he was when he died, he's left this imperishable thing, version of himself for posterity. And of course, I know that can't help you with your broken heart. It's just a great, great letter. I think also, I will say
Yeah,
this, I think they could bond as artists because they were so different. Just because, as you say, James would never have written a pirate story. But before he met Stevenson, he happened to review Treasure Island and he said, what a great story this is. So they each see the other's work as brilliantly done.
it's hard to imagine Robert Louis Stevenson reading one of one of Henry James's novels and thinking to himself, "Wow, this is really good. This is what I love," because his writing was so very different. I mean, it's difficult, in my opinion, to get through Henry James. I know I'm not alone in that opinion, but it's not difficult to get through Stevenson. But of course, there are plenty of people who don't like him. But it's remarkable because Henry James genuinely, he wasn't just blowing smoke because he liked Robert Louis Stevenson. He genuinely admired his writing.
Yeah, that's right. Because he could see, as those modern writers that I mentioned have seen, this is a great artist.
Hmm.
Every word is in the place where it needs to be. And because it's done so well, you don't even realize how much care and craft went into it. And he respected that in Stevenson.
Hmm. You mentioned a little bit about Stevenson's method, how he went about writing. He was often inspired and wrote in sort of a white heat. But when he had to really work at it or write under pressure, he didn't do well. But later in life, he dictated most of what his writing was. Is that correct? To his stepdaughter, Belle?
Yeah, that was because he had, I don't know what the medical name would be, some kind of painful condition in his right hand that made him get terrible writer's cramp. Uh,
Hmm.
And it turned out he felt more fluent if he could get up, and he was always restless. The best portrait of him is not a photograph because there was very long time exposures then, and people had to have a fixed expression. Uh, you could never see the volatile Stevenson because he was always having to pose. Charles Darwin said, "If I look anything like my photographs, it's a wonder I have a single friend in the world." Uh, so the best portrait is actually by John Singer Sargent, the American painter, uh, in which Stevenson is striding up and down, kind of leaning forward, this gaunt, skinny frame in his own living room, like a caged animal, Sargent said. And you see the energy of the man. Uh, yeah, I forgot where we were going with this. Where did we begin? Uh,
Well, I think, let's see, we
oh,
were
I know. It's
talking.
dictating to Bell.
Yeah.
So he's most comfortable composing the next paragraph if he can be striding up and down, and she's dutifully recording what he writes. Uh, and he'll pause to think and then come up with the next phrase. And Bell said in her own memoir, and never once did I guess correctly what was going to come next.
Hmm.
It always surprised me in some way. And she was very intelligent and um, would sort of chat with him about how the story was going. So he enjoyed the kind of collaboration as well.
And he collaborated, of course, with his stepson, not only on a couple of novels that they published, but you said that his stepson Lloyd went on to write a lot himself, and you said none of which is remembered today. Can you talk a little bit about, because I was curious, again, you take the reader. It doesn't drive off a cliff. When Stevenson dies, you talk about what happened to those other people in his life who were
Yeah,
so important.
I always wish biographers would do that because you've gotten to
Yes,
know them so well.
yes.
Henley, the one-legged guy, had broken with Stevenson.
Hmm.
It's not important over so somebody they knew that he was sort of defending against what Henley thought was injustice, but I think it was deeper than that. For years, Henley had been an unpaid agent when Stevenson was struggling, and Henley is the guy, instead of writing more poems, had to be an editor to make ends meet. So there was a kind of jealousy there. So I've said, what a shame it was. Everybody said so, that these guys who'd been so close now weren't speaking to each other. And Henley stumbled getting off a train and died on the platform outside the train. That's what happened to him. Fanny lived on for quite a few years, though was always older than Lewis, and eventually remarried and lived in San Francisco and then down near Santa Barbara. And people who met her, even as in late middle age, said that is the most fascinating woman I ever saw. That's the only woman I would die for.
Mm.
So, it's interesting to follow the people out. His mother had, amazingly, as a proper Edinburgh lady, after her husband died, and when Lewis and Fanny were preparing to go to America and then the South Seas, said, "I'm coming with you," and turned out to be a very adventurous soul. And loved going barefoot in Samoa, which was considered very wrong if you were a European or American there. And Belle went on to have a complicated life of her own, and you mentioned Lloyd. Yeah, so I just wanted to follow out all these people that had known him and what became of them, including the close friends that died of alcoholism. And, there's a lot of tragedy there as well.
Hmm. Did you mentioned that Lloyd didn't really need to make a living off his own writing because by that time his mother was dead and he was living off of the estate of Robert Louis Stevenson, which it led me to wonder. I wanted to know a little bit more about that. Did Fanny's two children and of course any grandchildren, did they make pretty good money off Stevenson's book in the 20th century books?
Yeah, until the copyright ran out, and I can't remember when the date would have been.
Hmm.
But those books were constantly being republished, and there was always royalties. So
Hmm.
yeah, they were just depositing checks for years and years.
Hmm. And they're all in the public domain now, one
Yeah,
assumes.
right.
Yeah, which is why they're all available on Kindle for $2.50 or whatever it is.
That's right.
As we bring this to a close, I want to be mindful of your time. I dare ask, is there another biography in you? Are you working on something new?
I'm working on a group biography, which I've done once before, and I'm not ready to disclose it.
Yeah,
But that's what I am doing.
that's terrific news for those of us who loved reading your writing. Well, the author is Leo Damrosch. The book is entitled Storyteller, The Life of Robert Louis Stevenson. It was published on September 2nd by Yale University Press. Leo, thank you so much for coming on and talking about it. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you. I enjoyed it greatly.
My thanks to Leo Damrosch for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at yalebooks.yale.edu. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. If you're a fan of Today in Georgia History, and who isn't, check it out at the completely redesigned website at todayingeorgiahistory.org. You can see it and hear it currently airing twice a day on Georgia Public Broadcasting. You can find our podcasts anywhere you can find podcasts, including YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app, which would be most helpful and appreciated. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. You can also treat yourself to every podcast, every blog, and every dispatch from Off the Beaten Path at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.